Let's actually listen to Secretary of Defense Hegseth. He was at the Ramstein Group, NATO, essentially, his comments on NATO and Ukraine.
The United States does not believe that NATO membership for Ukraine is a realistic outcome of a negotiated settlement. Instead, any security guarantee must be backed by capable European and non-European troops. If these troops are deployed as peacekeepers to Ukraine at any point, they should be deployed as part of a non-NATO mission, and they should not be covered under Article 5. There also must be robust international oversight of the line of contact. To be clear, as part of any security guarantee, there will not be U.S. troops deployed to Ukraine.
Brian, it appears that what Hegseth is saying is that, especially in the initial stages, the big impetus is about getting the United States to transfer the responsibility for Ukraine. So, Brian, your thoughts?
I mean, what have we been saying for 3 years, Danny? Not just myself, but many other great guests that you've had on and interviewed over the last 3 years. That eventually Ukraine is going to collapse, and they need to create the U.S. and NATO need to create a buffer zone with their own troops inside whatever is left of Ukraine. I've been talking about this for 3 years. I've been warning about that being they're never going to accept defeat in Ukraine, and they will go ahead and they will do this. And they want to make sure that it's a non-NATO deployment because they want to absolve themselves from Article 5 obligations, and they don't want U.S. troops in there because they themselves don't want to get into a direct war with Russia, because this is all about overextending Russia, collapsing Russia, so the U.S. can isolate and then work on collapsing China. That's the whole point of all of this. It's all interconnected. And so they cannot get tangled. And I've said this many times, if the U.S. gets involved in Ukraine, I mean directly intervening, putting their troops in Ukraine, they're not going to have any resources left. We can see how stretched their military is. They're not going to have any resources left for the Middle East or for the Asia-Pacific region, where they're still trying to reassert dominance. So they have to make difficult decisions. And this was the theme all throughout the Biden administration. Their allies, their proxies, European nations, Canada, Australia, Japan, South Korea, all of these nations, they want to use them because the U.S. itself is overstretched. They're talking about using the industrial capacity of these nations, their military capabilities, their economy, and basically consolidating all of it. It's like a bunch of companies run very poorly, like the U.S. auto industry, and then it begins to collapse, and they consolidate them all together in some last-ditch effort to try to save something. That is what the United States empire is doing right now. And this is, and again, if you were paying attention and you filter out the left-right rhetoric, you could recognize that what Secretary Hegseth is saying is exactly what was being said all throughout the Biden administration. And this is what's so troubling, because it is this continuity of agenda so seamless, and yet because of people's bias, their political bias and their emotions, they're simply not seeing it. It's very frustrating, but it's very important that people wake up and see this and oppose this, because we're going in a very, very dangerous direction. The U.S. is basing its foreign policy on an irrational premise that a nation that makes up less than 5% of the world can have domination over the other 95+%. This is irrational. And when you pursue irrational policies like this on such a large scale, and we have nuclear weapons involved, it could only end in catastrophe for everybody. And so this is what we need to start thinking about. Not, I voted for this guy, I want my team to win, and I don't really even care if anything they're saying is true or not. I just want to feel like we're winning. Is that more important than continuing down this road toward catastrophic global conflict?
If Donald Trump doesn't do what he's doing right now, Donald Trump is going to make himself very irrelevant very fast. When I look at this development, I see that this is massively different rhetorically, and even, picking up the phone, talking to Vladimir Putin. This is different. How we interpret why it's different, I think depends on how we want to see the reality. For me, I see it as if they do not do this, if Trump doesn't do this, he's irrelevant. But all throughout this, Brian, even Hegseth, even Trump, they've all been saying they're going to increase sanctions
to further enable effective diplomacy and drive down energy prices that fund the Russian war machine. President Trump is unleashing American energy production and encouraging other nations to do the same. Lower energy prices, coupled with more effective enforcement of energy sanctions, will help bring Russia to the table. Safeguarding European security must be an imperative for European members of NATO. As part of this, Europe must provide the overwhelming share of future lethal and non-lethal aid to Ukraine.
I mean, Hegseth did this a bunch where he would continuously refer to the need to put everything on Europe, basically saying, Europe, you're up. This is your conflict now. But your thoughts about this sanctions bit? It would be very interesting to see Donald Trump bring this to the table because it's a non-starter.
This is literally a continuation of what the Biden administration was doing. I mean, if you weren't looking and you weren't familiar with his voice and you weren't aware that an election took place, you would swear that this was just another day in the Biden administration. This is all they've went on about for the last 3 years. Sanctions, sanctions, sanctions on Russia. They're still talking about it. If you go to the think tanks where all of this foreign policy comes from, again, regardless of who is in the White House or who controls Congress, this is all the think tanks are talking about. They're looking for every little sanction. But even the think tanks understand that the sanctions aren't working and they probably aren't going to work, but they don't know what else to do. So again, this goes back to the core issue, which goes even beyond NATO. It is America wanting to maintain primacy over the entire planet. And it is physically incapable of doing it, but it insists on trying anyway. And so this is what happens. You have sanctions that don't work. You have a military that's overstretched and cannot keep up with these nations that the US is targeting, especially Russia, especially China. And then we just see a continuation of them going in these circles with the only tools that they have, even though they tried to pretend that some sort of political transition did take place between the Biden and Trump administration. They're still waving around the same set of tools that they have been trying to use to get Russia to the table, get them to at least freeze the conflict so that they can reprioritize with war with China. And by the way, war with China is still war with Russia. Ultimately is a war on the multipolar world. And so it doesn't really matter who you're targeting. If you're targeting any one of these nations that are pillars of the multipolar world, you're attacking the entire multipolar world. And so people have to try to understand this. I mean, why is he still talking about sanctions? And did you notice he's still talking about weapons flowing to Ukraine? He's just saying, we're not going to do it. Why are we not going to do it? Because we don't have any left. And we need to save the weapons that we have left for all these other wars that we're planning. By the way, where does Europe get a lot of its weapons from? From the United States. So, yeah. I mean, these are all things that, look past the headlines, listen to what they're actually saying. They're telling you nothing has changed and that they're just doubling down on everything that they've been doing up until now.
And I would argue, Brian, that a lot of the reasons why Europe is losing its mind is not so much because now it feels like there's going to be some significant burden it's going to have to bear. In truth, Europe can't bear any kind of burden on anything, really, because it is so dependent on the United States. You know that the United States essentially controls these countries, especially at the level of foreign policy and quote-unquote national security. Because what the Trump administration is doing is which I believe is a big part of its political orientation, which has served to change its approach and works for this approach. Joe Biden, as a neocon, very passionate American interventionist, he can't say, well, we're just in it for ourselves. But Donald Trump can say, well, it's all about the United States. Who cares about anything else in the world? That's what they can do. And I think that's what's allowing them to actually engage in this right now as a way to buy some time. But here is what Hegseth had to say, though, about American isolationism but with a bit of a China twist. Here we go.
We're also here today to directly and unambiguously express that stark strategic realities prevent the United States of America from being primarily focused on the security of Europe. The United States faces consequential threats to our homeland. We must and we are focusing on security of our own borders. We also face a peer competitor in the communist Chinese with the capability and intent to threaten our homeland and core national interests in the Indo-Pacific. The U.S. is prioritizing deterring war with China in the Pacific, recognizing the reality of scarcity and making the resourcing trade-offs to ensure deterrence does not fail. Deterrence cannot fail for all of our sakes.
The border and China, those are the big threats, actually, and they will deter China and with the resourcing needs possible to ensure that this peer competitor does not get too powerful. So, Brian, your reaction to this?
Well, exactly. Again, continuity of agenda. This is what the Biden administration was obsessed with, ultimately China. And even though people like to pick, people on the right like to pick on the Biden administration, they like to call President Biden Beijing Biden. But in reality, throughout the entire Biden administration, they were preparing for war with China. That was the top priority. This conflict with Russia is meant to isolate China before the U.S. focuses entirely on China. If you have been following along over the last 2 decades, China building up its Belt and Road Initiative to circumvent possible maritime choke points, the U.S. is already preparing to cut off Chinese maritime shipping through. The U.S. has been desperately trying to cut the Belt and Road Initiative over land. If China shares this long border with Russia, and these two nations are allies, the huge amount of natural resources that Russia possesses, the ability to move trade through Russia to many other countries, you can't isolate China. You need to diminish, overstretch, and if possible, topple and then politically capture Russia to then further and fully cut off China. That is the whole strategy. It has been since the end of World War II. This is all that they've been doing for decades and decades, again, regardless of which administration is in power. And Secretary Hegseth is tying this to the border because if he just explained what the U.S. is really trying to do, the U.S. wants to be the preeminent power in the Asia-Pacific region. In Asia, where the U.S. isn't even located on a map. American people would say, why are we doing that? So they have to tie China to the U.S. border, to fentanyl, to illegal immigration, it's demagoguery. It's to scare the American people. It's to incite fear and hatred and panic. It's just another pretext, a false pretext the U.S. is using to legitimize its foreign policy, just like they lied about WMDs in Iraq, or they lied about human rights violations in Libya or Syria. They're doing the exact same thing vis-a-vis Russia and China, and ultimately they're trying to tie everything to China. I don't blame people for not sitting down for 4 hours and listening to Senator Marco Rubio while he was going through his confirmation hearing as Secretary of State. But for 4 hours, that's all he talked about was China. China this, China that. China is the root of all of our problems, and we have to deal with China, which is all they said for 4 years under the Biden administration, 4 years under the previous Trump administration, 8 years of Obama, and so on and so forth. It is the continuation of this policy. Ultimately, they need to stop China from surpassing the collective West. If it surpasses the collective West, it'll do so irreversibly. And this is simply something the special interests that control the collective West cannot tolerate. They just, on so many levels, they cannot tolerate it. And so that is what is driving all of this foreign policy, ultimately. Now, how do people listen to that and walk away thinking that anything has changed in terms of U.S. foreign policy? I don't understand it.
Well, for me, Brian, what seems to be changing here is not so much the what is the ultimate agenda, right? I don't believe the United States is going to quit on trying to contain the multipolar world, to weaken it, to destroy it, with China at the head. I don't believe that it wants to allow Russia to continue on a path of stability and growth. However, it seems like the how is really in question. The how now the difference between the Biden administration and the Trump administration can be viewed as, well, how does this occur? And what is really at stake here, it feels like, Brian, is that we are in a moment where the Trump administration ultimately seems to be expressing an admission of defeat. Even um, uh, Trump, when he talks about BRICS, 100% tariffs, he reiterated that today. I defeated BRICS. Uh, nobody batted an eye at the tariffs that were being proposed against BRICS. Nobody said, well, we're not going to join BRICS because of that. But a lot of this bluster mixed with attempts to kind of stall, it feels like it's more of a, well, what is the next move, rather than what is the best move for peace? What is the next move for empire? That's what it feels like for me. What does it feel like for you?
That's exactly it. It's what is the next move for the U.S. empire? Nothing is working, and they need to reorganize, regroup, and redirect their efforts, their energy, their resources. That's all this is. It is all just rearranging the deck chairs on the sinking ship that is American imperialism. That's what has been from administration to administration. That's what it continues to be. When the Trump administration says America first, the MAGA movement is just branding slapped on the continuation of U.S. hegemony worldwide. That's all it is. If you ask me, what does America first mean? I would say it should mean leaving the rest of the world alone and investing inward. Doesn't mean isolationism. You can trade with everybody. You can trade and deal with absolutely everyone, but invest inward on your own country. Build a real economy that is based on actually making tangible things, not playing with numbers on spreadsheets, but actually making physical things. I don't know, kind of like how China and Russia, why their economies are able, I was listening to the Hudson Institute the other day, one of these think tanks, corporate funded think tanks, and they were complaining about how they used to joke about how small the Russian GDP was, and all of these stereotypes about how weak and pathetic the Russian economy is. But it turns out that they admitted this, what the GDP is actually made up of is very important. So the U.S. has a massive GDP, but if all of it is pyramid schemes on spreadsheets, then what real meaning does it have in the physical world? When you go to war, how does that actually physically, tangibly help you? It turns out the Russian economy is based on natural resources and manufacturing, which gives it tremendous power. So it's a much smaller GDP, but it packs a bigger punch. And so this is what America needs to look inward and do. They need to build a real economy. They need to prioritize the American people over these corporations that place profit above all other purposes, including the self-preservation of America as a functioning nation state. But what does America first really mean for the Trump administration? It means putting these corporate financier special interests first. That is what the tariffs are there to do, to preserve and reassert American corporate monopolies, all of the monopolies they have over the auto industry, telecommunications, including things like smartphones, everything that the U.S. held monopolies over for decades. That is what this is all meant to preserve. All U.S. foreign policy is aimed at preserving the corporate financier interests. That's what they mean by America first. And it by no means means investing inward on America. It means reasserting American dominance over the entire planet. I was listening to Jamison Greer, the U.S. trade representative, during his confirmation hearing before the Senate. And literally in his opening statement, he said that all trade policy should contribute to making America dominant in all areas, economics, military, technology. That is the actual goal here. That is the actual agenda. And That transcends all presidential administrations. Again, if you look through the rhetoric, they're saying it. They're telling you this.
There's a lot of hope beyond hope, right? They always say cope beyond cope. Like a lot of hope that this will lead to a confirmation of what Donald Trump and whatever U.S. political figure says they are, without regard to what exactly could happen, should happen, and will happen. Because I think what should happen, of course, is everything that you said. The United States should do exactly as you said. Donald Trump literally just axed what wasn't even happening, which is, I think, a testament to a lot of what Donald Trump is doing right now, is axing the high-speed rail in California project. Axe that's never going to happen. Well, it wasn't happening anyway, but it is a testament to, well, yeah, there isn't a commitment to building up the United States at all. There isn't a commitment to improving its infrastructure. Actually, there's a commitment to pushing away, even with regard to Taiwan and China. There's a huge push to keep them away, keep their tariffs. What that does is actually keeps things away. So advancements like what China's done with renewables, like what Taiwan and China now increasingly are doing with semiconductors, all that will be kept away because that's what tariffs are. They are a tax on the American people, which actually keeps away the kind of investment that's needed to learn how to do certain things, like maybe, build better electric cars, which Elon Musk can't do anymore. He laughed back in the day. Ha, 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 ha. China will never catch up to us. Now China has. They build better electric cars, cheaper,
I remember
better.
that.
And now there's 100% tariffs on them that I haven't heard Donald Trump want to reverse.